The Apostle Paul is one of the most historically verifiable figures of the ancient world. His letters were accepted by the early church and authenticated by leaders like Polycarp and Clement, who were directly connected to the original circle of the apostles. In modern Islamic apologetics, Paul is portrayed as a rogue infiltrator, a malicious architect accused of hijacking the teachings of Jesus and poisoning early Christian doctrine with the concept of tarif, or corruption. This narrative claims that Paul single-handedly ruined the original message of Christ. However, the historical record suggests this version of Paul is not an original tenet of Islam, but a late-stage fabrication, born out of polemical necessity. This investigation begins with the 8th century framework of St. John of Damascus. Under the Umayyad Caliphate, he viewed the emergence of Islam as the heresy of the Ishmaelites. John of Damascus argued that early Islamic theology was a regression, reliant on prior Christian errors and recycled heresies he had already seen debated within the Church. We can map the evolution of this polemic across 3 distinct eras: the early Islamic period before the 9th century, the Mutazilite era of the 11th century, and the late-stage apologetics of the 14th century. Our objective is to determine if later Muslim scholars plagiarized first-century heretics to resolve a contradiction within their own theology. If the evidence reveals the case against Paul was invented centuries after the fact, the primary justification for rejecting the reliability of the New Testament loses its foundation. The literature from the first 3 centuries of Islam reveals a historical memory that contradicts the modern caricature. In this early stage, the disciples of Jesus were remembered quite differently. In the Quran, Surah 36 describes 2 messengers sent to a city who were rejected by the inhabitants, until God declared, "We strengthened them with a 3rd." To understand who these 3 messengers were, we have to look at how the earliest Islamic exegetes interpreted this passage. Scholars of early tafsir, or Quranic commentary, reached a unanimous consensus that the city mentioned in this verse is Antioch. This consensus was established by the most authoritative historians in the Islamic tradition, including Ibn Ishaq, al-Tabari, and al-Falabi. These foundational scholars recorded the specific names of the 3 messengers God sent to Antioch to preach the message of Jesus. Those messengers were identified as Peter, John, and Paul, referred to in the Arabic texts as Bulus. This indicates that the earliest Muslims understood the Quran as identifying Paul as a legitimate messenger of God. The heroic, divinely sent Bulus found in early Islamic tradition cannot be reconciled with the rogue architect of corruption found in modern polemics. This shift occurred as the Islamic Empire expanded over Christian territories between the 8th and 10th centuries. This territorial growth gave Muslim scholars direct and extensive access to the actual texts of the New Testament for the first time. They immediately encountered a theological collision between the Christian scriptures and the Quran. The New Testament dataset explicitly claimed the reality of the crucifixion and the deity of Christ. These points directly contradicted the Quranic dataset, which featured an explicit denial of those very doctrines.
The crisis was clear. If the New Testament was authentic, the Quran was wrong. To maintain the Quran's authority, the New Testament had to be framed as a fabrication. The doctrine of tarif, textual corruption, was the polemical bridge engineered to solve this problem. This strategy reached its peak in the 11th century with the Mutazilite scholar Abd al-Jabbar and his work Tathbit Dalail Nubuwwat. Abd al-Jabbar introduced the accusation that Paul sought Roman political favor and invented the Trinity as a tool to gain power. This move toward demonizing Paul arrives late in the historical record, acting as a patch for a theological crisis that early Muslims never acknowledged. If these accusations against Paul do not exist in the Quran or the early tafsir, we have to look for their actual origin. Research by historian Shlomo Pines tracked the source code of these Islamic polemics to a much older era. He identified the source as the Ebionites, a fringe 1st-century Judaizing sect that was rejected by the early church for denying the divinity of Christ. The Ebionites held a specific hatred for the Apostle Paul. They rejected his epistles entirely, labeling him an apostate from the law. The thematic mapping is precise. The Islamic rejection of Paul is a direct copy of the Ebionite rejection of Paul. This creates a logical dead end. To discredit Paul, Islamic scholars adopted the arguments of a sect that also rejected the foundational theology of Islam. The Islamic historical critique of Paul is merely recycled first-century Christian heresy, lacking any original, divine, or historical basis. In the 14th century, the scholar Ibn Taymiyyah escalated this polemic further in his text, Al-Jawab al-Sahih. Ibn Taymiyyah shifted the narrative, turning Paul into a conspiratorial figure who actively worked to sabotage the faith from within. To make this internal sabotage sound familiar to these readers, Ibn Taymiyyah used a specific historical analogy. He compared Paul to Abdallah ibn Saba. Abdallah ibn Saba is the figure traditionally accused of infiltrating early Islam to create the schism between Sunnis and Shiites. This argument is an act of historical projection. Ibn Taymiyyah used an internal Islamic trauma to try and explain Christian history. The analogy fails because Paul was universally accepted by the actual first-century apostolic network, unlike the divisive figures of early Islamic history. This parallel has no basis in the Christian record. It exists only in the minds of late-stage Islamic polemicists. The infiltrator narrative serves as a psychological shield designed to explain away why every early church community accepted Paul's teaching as authoritative. The Islamic narrative against Paul is a three-layer fabrication. It relies on late-stage polemics, plagiarized heresy, and historical projection. Removing this caricature reveals the historical saint who is recognized by both the early church and the earliest generations of Muslims. The Christian record shows an unbroken chain of custody from Jesus to the apostles, and then to the early church fathers. The New Testament manuscript tradition provides a consistent record that predates these Islamic revisions by over half a millennium. The Apostle Paul stands vindicated by history. The attempt to erase him from the record is ultimately a confession of a much deeper theological crisis.